All right, everybody. This is the lecture video for week 6, day 1. It's about preferences, preference maps, and indifference curves. I'll hop right into it. So the reading is pages 57 to 64, and the sections are titled Consumer Preferences, Preference Maps, and Indifference Curves. So remember that when we talk about economics, I define it as how societies and individuals allocate scarce or limited resources to unlimited wants and needs. So in this unit, basically, we're going to be talking about mainly how individuals allocate their scarce resources to unlimited wants and needs, and then you can kind of aggregate it from there. For societies, you have all the tools you need, and so in week 6, our task is to really start formalizing about how economists think about wants and needs and how that translates from consumption to doing the best for your own wants and needs. And so I'll start by just talking about a couple applications of this. With preferences, we really need to think about how we compare one bundle of goods or options to another bundle of goods or options. And so a couple applications for this would be one like medical school residency matching. So when you're a doctor and they're trying to decide where you will go to do your residency to learn about stuff, in medical school, you rank your preferences to determine where you are matched with. Um, Another one would be like college choice. So you rank your applications among your various favorite alternatives. And then another application could be like if you're choosing where to go out to eat, uh, and narrowing it down to two options is a cheap psychological trick in a book that my parents got me. It's easier to compare two things to each other than one thing than amongst three options because you have to make all the comparisons. But anyway, so we need to talk about what preferences are to an economist and how we define them in our pursuit of rigorously defining how people get to their satisfy their wants and needs. So what people want and need. This really has nothing to do with budget or affordability. That's in week 7. And it's nothing really to do with value laden righteousness judgment. We don't pass judgment on people normatively saying, they shouldn't smoke something or they should consume, healthy food. As an economist, we're more interested in making predictions, and we need to do that without passing judgment on those choices. And so you've already seen us talk about preferences um, within the context of demand. So we know that a change in preferences can shift the demand curve. So, like if over the 2000s, basically preferences for energy drinks increased. Before like 2000, no one had heard of an energy drink. And so the prevalence of energy drinks shifted the demand out for energy drinks, or another example would be preferences for horseshoes has decreased because we don't use horses as our main transportation anymore. But while you've seen it in the context, preferences in the context of shifting the demand curves, we're not as interested in that in this session. We're going to mostly assume that preferences are stable and then figure out how we can uh, understand how consumers make choices given stable preferences. And so we need to talk about the three properties of preferences that we'll be working under to give us an understanding of how consumers make decisions. And those preferences are completeness, transitivity, and more is better. And so I'm going to explain those to you in these slides. Property 1 is completeness. And so complete preferences just means that individuals can rank all pairwise, that is, one option to one other option. They can rank those choices. Specifically, we can say that A is weakly preferred. That's this greater, kind of curly greater than with an approximate sign underneath. And we say that A is weakly preferred to B, or we could say that B is weakly preferred to A. What matters is that we can decide which one we prefer to the other one. And weakly just means that you could be indifferent between them. So they could be equally satisfying to you. And this weak preference basically rules out an indecision between two choices. So some completeness examples that we have are you could prefer soccer to basketball, where soccer is A and basketball is B. You could prefer a 10-year sentence to a life in jail. Or you could, if you're a dog, prefer having treats to being pet. And so these are kind of my completeness examples. And you can see that in all of these cases, our hypothetical decision maker was able to rank between two choices. And so if you can rank two choices against each other and you always know which one you would prefer, then we say that preferences are complete. And so we can actually go beyond just two choices and do three choices, four or five, up to n choices, basically. Um, and so if we have three choices, say soccer, basketball, and football, you just need to be able to rank all pairwise comparisons. So in this one, so this person prefers soccer to basketball, this person prefers soccer to football, and this person also prefers basketball to football. And so these preference relation symbols could be in either direction. All that matters is that they have a preferred option amongst them. And this note is just to remind you that A preferred weakly preferred to B could also be rewritten B as uh, less preferred than A. And so that is the first property of completeness, which is fairly simple. Property two is transitivity. And so this just is logical consistency amongst the choices. And for transitivity, we need to have at least three choices to define what it is. And so this basically says that if you prefer A to B and you prefer B to C, then you must prefer A to C. So if you like A better than B and B better than C, then for your preferences to be transitive, like the transitive property in mathematics, then you have to have also A being preferred to C. And so I'll talk about some examples and what I've kind of already talked about. So if you prefer soccer over basketball, A to B, and you prefer basketball over football, B to C, then you must prefer soccer over football, A to C. And so it has this like kind of chained kind of look to it. And so another example is if you prefer a 10-year sentence over life in jail, and you prefer life in jail over the death penalty, then you must prefer a 10-year sentence to the death penalty. You can't prefer a 10-year sentence over life in jail and prefer life in jail over the death penalty, and then prefer the death penalty over the 10-year sentence. Then your preferences would be intransitive and they'd be violating one of our properties. And so finally, with the dog, if you prefer treats over pets, and you prefer pets over being put in your crate, then you prefer treats to being in the crate. So if you like treats more than pets and pets more than the crate, then it'd be really weird if you liked going in your crate more than you like treats, given that you liked treats more than you liked pets and pets more than you like the crate. So anyway, those are our property one and property two. This is property two is transitivity. And so if your preferences are complete and transitive, then we say that your preference relations are rational. So basically what we're saying when we say rational is we're saying the consumer has well-defined preferences between any pair of alternative choices. We're not saying when we say rational in economics, the consumer's preferences don't make sense to us. That would be a normative statement. And we're doing positive economics where we're trying to make predictions about the world. So if somebody has complete and transitive preferences, they have rational preferences in our world. Okay. Finally, property three is perhaps even the most intuitive, is that having more of something is better than having less of something. So this appears true for most people. And if there's free disposal, then having more of something can never make anybody worse off. So most results would hold without this property, but it vastly simplifies our analysis and it seems to conform to and our real lived experience. So property three, more is better, simple. But we need to talk about preference maps. So we use preference maps to visualize relationships between bundles of goods, and we can need to know what preference maps are consistent with the properties that we just talked about. And so by this more is better and complete and transitive properties, we know how bundles compared to A would make a consumer better or worse off, like we talked about with their unlimited wants and needs. So I'm going to go through and relate a bunch of different bundles to this bundle A, and we'll figure out which one is better and which one is worse. Let's start with point B. So at point B, well, first consider, they have 2 soccer jerseys and they have 2 basketball jerseys. And that's point A, and that's our reference point. Now, let's look at point B here, which is they have 3 soccer jerseys and 3 basketball jerseys. And so we know that they have more soccer jerseys than point A and more basketball jerseys than point A. And so by more being better, we know that B is preferred to A. That is, they'd much rather have, or not much rather, but they would rather have 3 soccer jerseys and 3 basketball jerseys than 2 soccer jerseys and 2 basketball jerseys. So B is preferred to A. Okay? And the next point we need to talk about is W. So at point W, they have less soccer jerseys. They went from 2 soccer jerseys to 1 soccer jersey. And they have less basketball jerseys. They went from 2 basketball jerseys to 1 basketball jersey. And so we know that this person will weakly prefer A to W. So those two are kind of the most obvious cases. Now we need to look at point C. So you'll notice in point C, you have more soccer jerseys, but the same amount of basketball jerseys. So since you still have the same amount of basketball jerseys, but you got an additional soccer jersey, you didn't lose anything. And so we can say for certainty that point C is preferred to point A. And point D, kind of the symmetric case of that, is that if you have the same number of soccer jerseys too, and you gain an additional basketball jersey, we know that you'll be better off because you haven't lost any soccer, but you've gained a basketball jersey. So point D is preferred to point A. All right, now point Y. All right, so now you have the same amount of basketball jerseys and 1 less soccer jersey. We know for sure that A is preferred to Y because you lost a soccer jersey and you didn't gain any new basketball jerseys. So in this case, A is weakly preferred to Y. And then again, the symmetric case for losing an item is if you have the same amount of soccer jerseys and lose a basketball jersey, then you'll be worse off. And we know that A is preferred to point Z. And so that's how those properties map into preference maps, which will be an important part of this unit. And so kind of the last part that I'm going to get more in depth with in the next video is how to kind of use these preference maps to understand differences between having more of one item but less of the other. Because you'll notice in the last one, I only had either more of one and the same of the other or opposite way around. And so let's say that we have 2 points. Let's say 5 soccer jerseys, 5 basketball jerseys, and 8 basketball jerseys, 1 soccer jersey. Well, we need to know, is the consumer better off at 5-5 or 8-1? All right, so now we need to understand these. And so I'm calling this 5-5 point A and 8-1 point B. And so for our first individual, who I've named Howard, we say that Howard is indifferent between 5-5 and 8-1. So basically, Howard would get the same amount of happiness or satisfaction, or what we'll define as utility in the next section. That is, he doesn't care. He gets the exact same amount of utility from having 5 soccer jerseys, 5 basketball jerseys, as he does from having 8 basketball jerseys and 1 soccer jersey. And that's shown by this blue line that runs through both curves, which we call an indifference curve. And the reason it's called an indifference curve is because he's indifferent between all the points on that curve. That is, he gets the same amount of utility from every single point on that curve. And so Howard doesn't care between 5, 5 and 8, 1, exact same happiness. And in this case, we have a curve that is closer to both axes, and I'm calling that I2. And point I2 runs through this point 4, 4. And we know that 5, 5 compared to 4, 4, Howard would prefer 5, 5 to 4, 4 because by a property of more is better, 5, 5 must be preferred to 4, 4. And so uh, he gets a greater amount of satisfaction or utility from being on I1 than being on I2. And so now let's talk about Flynn, who is our next hypothetical person. Flynn has the same, we'll consider the same 2 points for Flynn. However, notice that for Flynn, his indifference curve, the same one doesn't run through both points. So from this, we can conclude that Flynn prefers 5, 5 to 8, 1. He gets more satisfaction out of having 5 soccer jerseys and 5 basketball jerseys than he does from having 8 basketball jerseys and 1 soccer jersey. And we know that because this indifference curve is closer to both axes than this indifference curve. And so it can vary across people, which is another kind of important building block of economics, is that we don't kind of enforce the same utility functions or happiness functions on everyone. We allow for individual utilities. And so if you're interested in understanding this more, I suggest you visit your OpenStax Appendix B Figure 1 and know that these are the indifference curves that we're talking about. And they describe satisfaction or utility or happiness at multiple bundles of goods, where all the bundles of goods on the same curve, the individual has the same amount of utility or happiness. And so at every point on indifference curve U1, or UL, utility equals U, which is just to say it's constant along the same curve. So how you would read this is you would say that point A and B and C and D all have the same amount of utility, but they have less utility than point F because this utility curve is farther out from the axes than UM here. And UM is also greater than UL. Low, medium, high should make fairly intuitive sense. So we have a number of properties for indifference curves that follow from the properties that I've defined about preferences. And this will be part of your homework. We know that bundles on indifference curves farther from the origin are preferred to curves closer to the origin. That's what I talked about being farther away or closer to the axes. We know that there will be an indifference curve through every possible bundle on the preference map. We'll know that indifference curves cannot cross, and I'll have you show that in your homework. We know that indifference curves have a downward slope or a negative slope, although it's not constant, as you've seen by the kind of curve in them. And they cannot be thick. And you should also think about how that relates to the first property that I showed you here. And then just like one last slide, that I won't cover behavioral economics in depth in this course, but so far with the preferences, we haven't really considered psychological research on cognition and emotional biases, although this is becoming increasingly useful for understanding decision making. You can think of things like simplifying the FAFSA or novelty. Sometimes preferences aren't transitive, and one reason that this could be the case is that there are novelty of goods, endowment effects. So you could value items you own more than you value them in a store, and you have a preference for keeping what you own. This can kind of be minimized by high volumes of trading or expertise. And then salience, you're more likely to consider well presented information. So decision making has a cost. Another term for this is there's bounded rationality. So people only have so much energy to make carefully calculated cost benefit decisions. Um, but you're more likely to think about big purchases uh, more closely. Anyway, uh, people hate the rationality assumption. The first thing you need to remember is that it's not about like the sanity of your self-held judgments of whether the choices are kind of right that people make. Um, what might be in the best interest for you is not the best interest for others always. And remember that we just mean that preferences are complete and transitive. So you can make comparisons and they are logically consistent. And if you think that people aren't rational, I'll note that there's an experiment in the 70s which showed that rats have complete and transitive preferences over root beer and water. One way that students have pushed back in the past on this is they say, well, rats have easy decisions, humans have hard decisions, and that's fair, but I'm saying um, ceteris paribus, so all else equal, if rats can make decisions over goods, I think it's fair to believe that humans can in many cases as well. And so I'll just end with that. And then in the next video, we'll get on to utility more in depth. So thanks for coming out.